Tēnā koutou katoa, kei ngā maunga whakahi o Tāmaki, ngā wahi tapu, ngā whenua I takahia e ngā mātua tūpuna, tēnei ka mihi. Ki ngā mana whenua o tēnei rohi, Ngāti Whātua, Ngāti Paua, me tainui waka waikato iwi hoki. He mihi ki ngā iwi me ngā hapu katoa, ka whai pānga ki ngā whenua o Tāmaki Makaurau. He mihi nui. Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. Well, hello everyone, and thank you all for being here today. It's an honour and a privilege to be speaking at the Writers' Festival and to be part of such a wonderful week of coming together to celebrate writing, knowledge and imagination. And it's been a great week so far. I'd like to thank the festival organisers for inviting me here today and Bridget for her introduction. I'm going to be speaking a bit about my book today, but I'd like to start by acknowledging Michael King, after whom this lecture is named. He's a historian that I read and studied growing up and who I admire for his huge contribution to understanding our past in Aotearoa, New Zealand. I also admired King's ability to write for a wide audience, not just for other academics. Historians are, in essence, storytellers, and I think Michael King excelled at that. But this book is quite different from some of King's better-known works, such as the Penguin History of New Zealand. It's not a sweeping, all-encompassing history of a city, or a region, or a nation. Rather than taking a bird's-eye view of the past, a wide but sometimes distant view, I wanted to explore the nooks and crannies of history on the ground, in rocks, in lava flows, in a grassy paddock, in the remains of a garden, in a monument, for instance. I was interested in the texture and the specificity of histories embedded in place. I wanted to start with the ground, as Bridget said, and to work my way upwards and outwards from there. To ask how might these histories change some of the ways we currently understand this city. Well, the book focuses in on 3 places in Auckland: Pukekawa, also known as Auckland Domain, which you can see at the top of the map of Auckland there. It's a central Auckland park and home to Auckland Museum. The second place is Maungakiekie, or One Tree Hill in Cornwall Park, and that's the middle place there on the map. That's in the central suburbs of Auckland, New Zealand's largest pa, or defensive settlement, with the landmark obelisk on the summit of the volcanic cone. And the third place is the Otuatawa Stonefields at Ihumātao, the place at the bottom of the map there. In Māngere, next to the Auckland airport, and a place that most people have driven past all of their lives without knowing about until the recent protests there in 2019. These places really are just starting point for exploring the histories under our feet. And I could have chosen any number of places to write about. I chose these places because they're in different parts of Auckland, so each has their own constellation of geographies, histories and identities. Yet each of them also opens up a view shaft into lesser known histories that I think deepen and at times challenge the bigger stories we tell about this city. Before I delve into each of these places though, I just want to talk a little bit about how this book came to be. It's got a long lineage of over 20 years, one that begins with my work as a public historian in the late 1990s, continued with my research as a PhD student when I wrote the thesis that became this book, and one that also includes my more recent work as curator of history at Auckland Museum. And over that 20 plus years, I've been taught, supported and guided by a number of people with deep knowledge about some of the things I talk about in this book. And so though I stand here today as the author of this book, I also want to acknowledge the people behind the book, who I think of as the backbone of this work, or the tuara, as one of my advisors described it the other day. Without them, this book would have been different, not nearly as good, and I'm deeply indebted to all of them, and I'll mention a few of them as I go along today. So, like many Aucklanders, I grew up knowing very little of the history of this city. My parents weren't from Auckland, so they had few connections with the place, and when I studied history at school and university, there were no courses on Auckland history or on urban history. And I think the situation's still much the same today, although I'm hopeful that's about to change with the introduction of the New Zealand History School curriculum next year. So it really wasn't until I started working as a historian for local and central government, for museums and iwi and hapu, that I began to learn about the deep and layered histories in Auckland. As a public historian, I worked on histories embedded in material or tangible things, in monuments, landscapes, buildings, sites, objects, taonga, histories that aren't necessarily captured in the written sources that historians like to rely on, but are told instead in layers on the land, in the stories passed down, in a neglected grove of trees, for instance. One of the places that I worked on during that period was the Otuatawa Stonefields, which is in this image here behind me, when it became a historic reserve back in 1999. The stories that I came across there and in other places across the city were unlike any that I'd learnt about at university or read about in books or seen in museums. These stories were long, complex and nuanced, and sometimes painful. They were still very present for certain communities and had shaped the wider city, yet they were unknown to most Aucklanders and to most New Zealanders, and they remain unknown today. Despite the fact that Auckland is New Zealand's largest urban centre and home to 1/3 of the country's population, historians have paid relatively little attention to this city. There's been some excellent work done by historians, Russell Stone perhaps the most prolific of them, but there's a lot of history that remains outdated and unexamined. To this day, there are histories that still repeat old 19th century tropes about Auckland's past, that Māori were constantly at war in the pre-colonial era, for instance, that Tāmaki, today known as Auckland, had been abandoned by Māori and was empty when Pākehā first arrived in the area, and that colonial Auckland was a neo-Europe or a Little Britain. Well, the histories that I came across in my work didn't support these interpretations. They told very different stories. As well as a lack of historical research on Auckland, a lot of the city's physical or tangible history, including its many landmarks or tohu, have disappeared over the years as the city's continued to spread and intensify. Right under our feet today, for instance, is the Waihorotiu River, which once pooled here in Aotea Square, a gathering place for the waters running down the gullies from the ridgelines above us, before it continued down Queen Street and into the harbour. That river's now gone from sight, covered up and contained in a drain along with the histories that went with it. So it can sometimes be hard to make sense of this city from its physical environment and from its written histories. But there are still places where the past can be found, and it's those places that I wanted to write about. Place names that evoke a forgotten past, outlines on the land that trace a former presence, trees that mark a home long since gone, walls that organise the land according to earlier senses of belonging. These places tell stories that have been crafted into the land over time, but have often disappeared from the collective memory of this city. Well, as I said, the book started out as a PhD thesis, which doesn't bode well for writing a lively, accessible history or a good read. But I was in excellent hands from the beginning with my two outstanding supervisors, Professor Caroline Daly and distinguished Professor Dame Anne Sarmond, who helped shepherd this work into being. And there were various other colleagues and mentors, some of them here today, who reviewed chapters and provided invaluable advice at various stages. I'm particularly indebted to Mātua Bobby Newson, who generously wrote the mihi karakia in the book, to Kahutoi Te Kānawa, and also to Ropata Paura and Malcolm Patterson of Ngāti Whātua, Peter Ture of Ngāti Paua and Ngai Tai ki Tāmaki, and Pania Newton and the Makaurau Marae Committee whānau. It's been a privilege working with all of these people, and I've learnt so much from them, not least that there's so much more to learn. Well, I have the team at Bridget Williams Books to thank for turning the thesis into such a high quality and beautiful book. And I think you can see the care and work that they put into producing this book in the images behind me, which are all from the book. Except for this image, which is one of the blessing of the book at the Memorial for Te Wherowhero in the Domain. That's a place that I talk about a little bit later in this talk. We didn't have a book launch for this book because of, the pandemic, but we did have a small socially distanced blessing for the book with a number of people here in this photo that I've just mentioned. And in fact, I can't really think of a better or more appropriate place for bringing this book into the world. So for those of you who haven't read the book, and I'm sure there'll be a good number of you out there who haven't, it follows a loosely chronological framework from early human arrivals in New Zealand in around the 1300s through to the present day. But each chapter focuses in on a particular moment in one of the landscapes, and then it roves across space and time from there. So a very quick run through. There's a chapter on the early Māori Stonefield gardens at Ihumātao, one on a house built for Pōtātō Te Wherowhero in the Auckland Domain, another on a mission station at Ihumātao, one on the olive grove planted by John Logan Campbell at Cornwall Park, one on the Archie Market Gardens at the foot of the Domain, and one on the obelisk and other sites of memory at Maungakiekie. And this is one of the opening illustrations here for these chapters. These were done by book designer Keely O'Shannessy, also a good friend of mine, who captured so beautifully what I was trying to convey in words in the book cover, which you saw earlier, and in these illustrations for each chapter. So Keely used historic photographs to show different views of each landscape in her illustrations, and she highlighted the aspects that I focus in on in each chapter with these golden outlines, which you can see in this illustration are the rocks on the Stonefields. And I couldn't resist popping a couple more of those in because they're so gorgeous. So I think when you take this type of approach, when you start with the ground and you build your stories from there, it immediately shifts or refocuses Auckland's history in several ways. One of those is that you move away from short, truncated time spans that historians tend to work within, of a decade, or a century, say, or post-1840, which is a common one. And you start seeing some of the deeper histories that still underpin and explain this city today. The second thing is that you don't have to start in Queen Street, as many of our histories do. You can look instead at other parts of Auckland, places with their own histories, cultures, politics and networks that have in turn influenced things at the centre but are hard to see or understand when you start in town. And thirdly, starting with the ground broadens the archive for the historian from one that relies primarily on written sources to one that draws also on material sources, environmental histories, oral histories and spatial relationships to examine the past. I'm not an expert in all of these areas, far from it, but they all provide important insights into the various ways that the past has been experienced and understood. They make for a more kaleidoscopic view of history, one that has a long lens and takes in numerous perspectives. My job as a historian was to recover some of those layered, textured histories embedded in these places and then weave them into the bigger stories we tell about Auckland, New Zealand and the world. So let's have a look at some of these places. And we'll start with the Ōtuataua Stonefields at Ihumātao, a place that most people had never heard of a few years ago, certainly when I started writing this work in 2013, but it's better known today, and for good reason. It's a place where people have been picking up rocks for more than 600 years and carrying them, turning them in their hands, arranging and rearranging them to make walls, garden structures, houses, pathways, roads, and more recently airport runways. Histories here reach back to some of the earliest human inhabitants of the place we now call Auckland, forming important but little known histories that still underpin this city. The Otuatawa Stonefields were formed by the eruption of two volcanic cones called Ōtuataua and Pukekawa, or Pukekawa Hape as it's also known. The lava flows from those eruptions carried huge amounts of rock with them, creating a rough, dry landscape. And over time, fertile, well-drained volcanic soils formed on the lava fields, perfect for gardening. These eruptions happened all over Auckland, giving us our 50 or so volcanic cones, although many of them have since been quarried away. And you can see all of those cones, hopefully, on this map here from 1859 by Ferdinand von Hochstetter, which shows the volcanic cones in red, and then the lava flows surrounding them shown in those big pink pillowy circles around the cones. And you can see those lava fields cover much of Auckland. I'm just going to zoom in here to the part of the map that shows the Ihumātao area. You can see at the three bottom cones there's Ōtuataua and Pukekawa, and a third volcanic cone called Maungakiekie, which is now unfortunately been completely quarried away. Here's a map here of the Ihumātao area today, shaded in red, with the Otuatawa Historic Reserve shown in green there, the Ihumātao Papakaingaroa village just to the right of the reserve, and the nearby Auckland Airport shaded in grey down the bottom. Well, Māori histories of Ihumātao and the wider area also begin with the formation of the land and waters. And in one of those stories, a powerful ancestor called Mataaho formed all of Auckland's volcanic features, and his name is recorded in many of those features across the city, including Ihumātao, which is Te Ihu o Mataaho, or the nose of Mataaho. Place names like Ihumātao record some of the earliest histories in this city, and they also reveal notions of collective identity across the Auckland area that existed long before the city expanded to cover most of the volcanic plateau. The same broad group of people have been living at Ihumātao since the earliest days of human arrivals in the Auckland area, making it one of the oldest, if not the oldest, continuously occupied villages in Auckland. These deep histories have been recorded in Māori tribal histories and in the land itself, with archaeologists finding evidence of Māori living and gardening in the area from the 14 or 1500s. So you can see in this image here the various patterns and piles of rocks covering the landscape here on the Stonefields, and there are many, many layers of occupation and different activities here across hundreds of years. And that includes the gardening activities of early Māori in Auckland, who planted the tropical crops that their Polynesian forebears brought with them to New Zealand: kumara, taro, yam. Those crops grew well in the fertile soils of Tāmaki's lava fields, but Māori also used the rock strewn across the landscape to help create a warm, sheltered environment for those tropical crops in a subtropical climate. Drawing on the knowledge they brought with them from Polynesia, they cleared the loose volcanic rock from the lava fields to create cultivation areas. They piled up the rock onto existing ridges to create windbreaks, boundary walls and terraces, and they formed complex drainage systems for their gardens. Those rock wall systems across the Stonefields served not only as gardening structures though, they were also named after particular ancestors and events, so they were places of historical memory as well, which in turn helped to define and organise the way the Stonefields were occupied and gardened by family groups over generations. And the pathways in between that stonework guided people through the landscape, helping them navigate through tapu and noa areas. So as visitors walk through parts of the Stonefields today, they unwittingly follow these earlier systems of gardening, occupation and memory that are hundreds of years old. These Stonefield gardens once covered much of Auckland, all of those pink bits that we saw on the map by Hofstede a bit earlier. But almost all of those gardens have now been destroyed by urban development. The Otuatawa Stonefields is one of the very few areas that's left. As archaeologists have pointed out, these gardens tell the story of long peaceful periods of settlement in Tāmaki that have largely disappeared from the physical landscape and from the written record. So, Auckland history starts to look a bit different when you begin at a place like Ihumātao. Here, there are longer histories reaching back to the earliest inhabitants of Auckland and telling of continuities and fluidities in Auckland's past that are important to know alongside those stories of constant warfare that are often told in our histories. And built onto those very deep histories on the Ōtuataua Stonefields, there are also more recent histories there that offer different insights into colonial Auckland. Tāmaki, as pre-colonial Auckland was known, has often been portrayed as empty when Europeans first settled here in 1840. But when you look at a place like Ihumātao, a very different story emerges. In the previous couple of decades, during the intertribal musket wars, Māori from across the Tāmaki Isthmus had spent periods of time in Waikato under the protection of the leader Pōtātō Te Wherowhero. But throughout that time, they returned to Tāmaki periodically to replant their gardens and collect resources, and they moved back to their ancestral lands permanently in 1835. So by 1840, when Governor Hobson arrived to establish the government settlement of Auckland, Māori had resumed their seasonal patterns of planting, fishing, harvesting and filling the storage pits on their lands. Auckland, far from being empty or abandoned, was in fact a place full of movement across the land and waters in well-established patterns. And you can see those patterns on this map of tribal movements here from 1820 to 1840, which was produced originally by archaeologist Agnes Sullivan and based on court documents and tribal histories. So here, places such as Ihumātao, which you can see in the shaded area in the middle of the map there, are shown as a meeting point each spring for a number of tribes, all related through shared ancestors who planted gardens for fishing parties and lived there during the summer months. These rhythms were in operation when Europeans arrived in the area, and they continued after the colonial town of Auckland was established. In the first few years of European settlement, Māori lost a lot of their land in the Auckland area, but there were still some places where Māori continued to live on their ancestral lands, and Ihumātao was one of those places. In 1848, there were around 200 Māori living at Ihumātao under the leadership of Epiha Putini, who was an influential leader in colonial Auckland but has completely disappeared from its histories. Well, it was at Putini's request that a Methodist mission station was built at Ihumātao in the late 1840s on Māori land next to Putini's kāinga or village and beside the gardens of the Ōtuataua Stonefields. And you can see the mission station here in this painting, which was done by the wife of one of the local ministers. The station had a cottage, a schoolhouse, a wooden chapel, and dry stone walls for the gardens. And you can see to the right of the painting there, the kāinga or village beside it, with the Manukau harbour in the background and the Manukau heads in the distance. Well, I looked, but I couldn't find an image of Putini, but I could find one of Reverend Henry Laurie, who was the first missionary based at Ihumātao. In his annual reports to his superiors, Laurie noted that there was a strict daily routine at the mission station, with regular bells, hymns, scripture and prayer. But the reality on the ground appears to have been somewhat different. Despite their efforts to encourage Māori to settle in fixed locations and follow their routines, Māori continued their more fluid patterns of existence, and this in turn continued to shape the mission station and its wider networks. The missionaries noted, for example, how Māori in the area continued to move between their tribal lands, following their seasonal patterns of fishing, planting and harvesting along the lines of the map we saw earlier. Laurie and others often complained that they weren't able to find their Māori congregation, so they had to follow Māori as they moved around their lands so they could continue to preach to them. And as the missionaries travelled around the Manukau harbour, visiting settlements in the waka provided by Māori, they were broadly following the pattern of movements that had been in place there for hundreds of years. Well, as well as missionaries using existing Māori networks, Māori also began to use the missionary networks for their own purposes, often travelling between mission stations throughout Auckland, visiting the native school at Three Kings, which is shown here in the painting behind me, or coming into town to attend the native chapel, which was located just up the road from here where the Courtville apartments are now next to the Supreme Court. And on the lava fields beside the mission station, Māori continued to cultivate their gardens, providing food for the mission station, their Pākehā neighbours, and for the nearby township of Auckland. They continued to grow kumara on the Stonefields, but they also grew European crops such as potato, corn, wheat, and oats, and they kept pigs, cows, and horses. And the field systems there began to evolve to reflect these changing agricultural practices, which you can see if I zoom into that 1853 map of the Manukau harbour. There's the mission station that I've just circled in red at the bottom there, at the end of the Ihumātao Peninsula, and then the field systems, which are now rectangular on either sides of the maunga on the Stonefields. So throughout the 1840s and 50s, there were very different relationships being formed at Ihumātao than those at the centre of town. It was not so much a site of cultural hegemony or a neo-Europe, as early Auckland's often been portrayed, but more a mixed place, one forged by both existing tribal dynamics and the structures of the British Empire. One where the knowledge channels flowed both ways, from Māori to Pākehā, as well as vice versa. The sudden shift in this community was not in 1840, when Māori histories of Auckland tend to end and Pākehā ones begin, but later on in July 1863, where Māori were forcefully evicted from their ancestral lands at Ihumātao and other settlements around the Manukau harbour, just days before the Waikato War officially began. This moment arguably places the outbreak of the Waikato War in Auckland, and it brings the New Zealand Wars and its consequences into the city in a way that has not yet been sufficiently acknowledged in histories of Auckland. The raupatu or confiscations that took place after the war had devastating and long-lasting consequences for its Māori communities. And in this 1866 survey map of Ihumātao behind me here, you can see how the land there was carved up and sold to European settlers. Well, those consequences have continued to ripple through wider Auckland and New Zealand, as we saw with the 2019 protests at Ihumātao. So these are important stories to know if we're to understand and come to terms with this city's past and its present. I want to turn now to the second place in my book, Pukekawa, also known as Auckland Domain. And here's an aerial view of the domain looking towards town. You can see the Auckland War Memorial Museum on the right there, the playing fields, and the gardens with their tea kiosk and duck ponds. It's a place that many of you will be more familiar with than the Stonefields. It's a pleasant, picturesque landscape, and one that was largely created in the early 20th century, when much of the land there was cleared and reformed for the 1913 to 14 exhibition held in the Domain, and for the building of the museum shortly afterwards in 1929. But amid these more recent, carefully crafted landscape, there are also other places in the Domain that tell longer and more complicated stories about Auckland's past. The duck ponds in the Domain, seen behind me here, are actually freshwater springs, which were once part of a much larger swamp that was an important resource for Māori. And in colonial Auckland, the springs were also an important resource. When the capital first moved to Auckland in 1840, the Domain was part of the Governor's grounds, which ran from Government House, now on the grounds of the University of Auckland, all the way across to the Domain. And Governor Hobson planned to build his new permanent residence beside the springs, something which never actually eventuated as the government moved to Wellington eventually. But in 1840, Hobson began transforming the Domain, clearing the fern and converting the land to pasture for his horses, and building a large garden on the bank beside the springs. And this was New Zealand's first botanical garden. And this is the site of it right here, on the slope behind the springs, and today beside the tea and ice cream kiosk, and it's a site currently occupied by a particularly aggressive flock of geese. And here's an earlier view of the gardens. This is taken from the hospital grounds over the Domain, with the Domain springs there in the middle and the botanical gardens just to the right of the image there where the trees are. So the botanical gardens contained exotic flowers, fruit trees and seedlings, which were all collected from botanical gardens around the world, planted here, and then redistributed back out to settlers around the country. So from the very beginning of European settlement in Auckland, the Domain was an important site of collection, experimentation and dissemination of plants and scientific knowledge. Now, within this rapidly evolving colonial landscape in the Domain, there was also a cottage built for Pōtātou Te Wherowhero, the leading Waikato ariki or chief who later became the first leader of the kingitanga, or the Māori King movement. And here's an image of Pōtātou Te Wherowhero here. Now, I mentioned Te Wherowhero earlier when I was talking about Ihumātao. He had sheltered many of the Tāmaki tribes in Waikato during the intertribal musket wars, and then had escorted them back to Tāmaki in 1835. And Te Wherowhero had a number of houses across Auckland that were gifted to him, and this was just one of them. The cottage was built in 1845 by the governor of the time, by now Robert Fitzroy, and it was built on a site close to the government gardens and to the governor's planned new residence. The date of its construction, 1845, is important. It's right at the time that war was breaking out in Russell or Kororareka, at the beginning of what became the New Zealand Wars or the Land Wars. So Governor Fitzroy was wanting to secure the support of this powerful leader at a critical time for the country. The house was a strong statement of the mana of Te Wherowhero, of his close ties with the Crown, and of his central role in the future of Auckland. We're not exactly sure where the cottage was in the Domain, and there's a number of different theories about where it may have been. But my best guess from the historical records is that it was at the top of the ridge near the springs, looking out over the township of Auckland, on the site of what is now the Auckland Hospital grounds, or more specifically actually where the mental health unit is now located. And here's a map of the Domain here, and I've put an arrow, which I hope you can all see, showing the location of the cottage in the yellow shaded area there. And you can see the duck ponds in the middle there, and that lower shaded white circle is the botanical gardens. There's a better depiction of Te Wherowhero's cottage here on this 1860 survey plan of the Domain, and I've highlighted here the location of the springs there, and then Te Wherowherow's house is marked on the map there in the red shaded area. Here's a painting looking from the Domain towards the town of Auckland in 1843, which I think is similar to the view that Te Wherowherou would have had from the steps of his cottage. While he was living there, Te Wherowherou met with the governor often to discuss the Treaty of Waitangi and other issues with the government, but he also held a number of large hui in the Domain with Māori leaders from around the country as he continued to build and shape the tribal alliances and dynamics in the Tāmaki area. And it's said that Te Wherowherou also gave a new meaning to the name Pukekawa while he lived there, a name that literally means sour hill, but which he used to remember those who had died in the intertribal musket wars of the 1820s and 1830s, calling it the Hill of Bitter Tears. So Pukekawa is one of the very few places in Auckland where those wars are remembered, and it gives the 20th century museum, built on Pukekawa, much deeper foundations that reach into the ground and back across time. So here in the Domain, you had both Crown leaders and Māori leaders coexisting in the same space, creating very different but intersecting senses of identity and place, and both striving to maintain a fine balance at a critical time for Auckland and for New Zealand. Well, Te Wherowherow's cottage is now gone and it's been forgotten about by most Aucklanders, but it's always been remembered by Māori. In 1940, on the centennial of the township of Auckland, Te Puiaherangi, the Kingitanga leader, planted a tōtara in the Domain in memory of her great-grandfather, Pōtātou Te Wherowherou. And this is a photo of the tōtara here in the memorial site. It's the same site that I showed earlier in the talk. That memorial still sits silently from across the museum today, reminding Aucklanders of the deeper histories that reside in this place. Now, in the late 19th century, there's yet another layer of history in the Domain. After the government moved to Wellington in 1865, the botanical gardens by the springs became neglected, and they were soon taken over by a Chinese market gardener. And further down the hill, at the bottom of the Domain, Chan Ah-Chi and his family established their home and market gardens alongside one of the rivers that flowed down from the springs. This is a bird's eye view of the city in 1885. You've got the Domain there at the bottom of the image, Queen Street Wharf poking into the harbour at the top of the image there, and I've got the Domain Springs circled there with the blue circle. Just below them, the government gardens now occupied by Yet Li, a Chinese market gardener, and then another circle there which shows where the Ah-Chi market gardens were that ran alongside Stanley Street. And here's the Ah-Chi family with Chan Ah-Chi with his grandchildren and his nieces and nephews, and I think that one of Chan Ah-Chi's great-granddaughters is with us in the room today as well. So the Ah-Chi family lived at the bottom of the Domain from 1882 to 1920, when they were removed to make way for the rugby league stadium, Cornwall Park. Like the cottage of Te Wherowherou, the Ah-Chi Gardens were subsequently forgotten about by most Aucklanders until 2007, when Cornwall Park itself was destroyed and archaeologists uncovered traces of the Ah-Chi house and gardens underneath. The hundreds of gardening, cooking and recreational items found on the site opened up a world that's largely been left out of histories of Auckland and erased from the land. And here are just a few of the items here found during that excavation, which are now held by the Auckland Museum. What those excavations found were glimpses of a family that had one of the most successful fruit and vegetable businesses in Auckland at the time. The Ah-Chis supplied fresh produce to many of the city's households and restaurants, as well as to the newly developing cruise ship industry. And they had extensive commercial networks throughout New Zealand and around the world, including with China and America. It's a family that went on later to open the first Food Town supermarket in New Zealand. And all the while, at home, in the Domain, the Archies were carefully navigating the European settler practices and expectations of the time, while also implementing their own ideas, practices, and networks. Archaeologists found that the positioning of the house alongside the river, for instance, appeared to align with the spatial principles of feng shui rather than the European property boundaries and the neighbouring buildings. They found fantan counters from a traditional Chinese gambling game and Chinese coins, both here at the bottom of the image here, which were used by workers brought over from China by the Archie family, who also lived and worked on the gardens. And among the Chinese brownware ginger jars and rice bowls, they also found an English Royal Doulton teapot and teacups. And here's one of those teacups here. It's thought that these were used mainly to entertain European guests. And you can see that it's actually a standard English willow design on this teacup, but that's a design that actually derived from 18th century Chinese porcelain designs. So the teacup itself tells its own story of mutual English and Chinese borrowings over hundreds of years. So here in the Domain, underneath the carefully crafted 20th century landscape, there are earlier stories of relationships between people and their natural environment, the springs, rivers, gardens. There are deeper histories of war and commemoration. There are important relationships between the Crown and Māori leaders in colonial Auckland, and there are early Chinese histories that had a significant impact on the city. These stories are all right here in the centre of the city, but they're hard to see until you start peeling back the layers of the land and bringing them to the surface. Now, the final place that I look at in the book is Maungakiekie, also known as One Tree Hill and Cornwall Park. And here's an aerial photograph of Maungakiekie here, with the obelisk on the summit looking towards the city. Here I examine some of the narratives crafted by Auckland's most prominent settler, John Logan Campbell, and how those narratives have intersected with the deeper histories that reside in this place. And here's John Logan Campbell here in 1903 when he gifted Cornwall Park to the public. But I'm just going to talk about one of those stories today, and quite briefly, because you've all been listening to me for a while. And that story is about the remnants of a large olive grove at Maungakiekie, which was planted by Campbell in 1878. It's a grove that's always looked very out of place to me in the pastoral landscape of Cornwall Park. And it's out of place too with the histories of this era, which describe New Zealand in the late 19th century as a Britain of the South, and tend to focus on the mass conversion of the land to grass. But Campbell ran the olive grove as a commercial venture for over 20 years. And I think when you look more closely at the grove, you start to see that some 19th century settlers in Auckland may not have been trying to create a little Britain. They may have been crafting a broader sense of place here. Here's a map of Maungakiekie here, just showing the olive grove in the large brown shaded area to the left of the green part of the map. Cornwall Cricket Club now occupies the northern part of the grove, and Green Lane Hospital is just to the left of the grove. Well, we know now, of course, that our climate and geography are well suited to growing olives. But back in the 1870s, Campbell was one of a small but vocal group of individuals who were trying to develop products for non-British markets such as Spain, Italy, France, and the United States. In 1878, Campbell brought over 5,000 seedlings from Australia and planted them on the plateau where Huia Lodge and Acacia Cottage and a car park are now located. And you can see where that nursery was, just in the middle of the map there in the smaller oval red shaded area. Well, as well as the grove, Campbell also planted a vineyard which didn't survive, and he planned to build an Italianate home on the property as well. Plus, he wanted to build a campanile, which is an Italian bell tower on the summit of Maungakiekie, or One Tree Hill, next to the pine trees he'd planted there recently. Well, none of these Mediterranean elements eventuated except for the olive grove, but I think they indicate that Campbell was planning a more multi-dimensional sense of place at Maungakiekie than merely replicating a British landscape. After trying and failing to graft the seedlings with more imported stock, Campbell paid a very skilled Canadian orchardist, Captain Robert Janes, to do the grafting work for him. Once that was done, the seedlings were planted out over the slopes of the terraces where some of them remain today. And here's a photo here of the young grove looking towards Mount St John or Te Kōpuki on the left and Mount Hobson or Henero on the right, with the Green Lane Hospital in the upper left of the image. Now, the ground on which the olive trees were planted had once been part of an extensive and famous Māori gardening area at Maungakiekie in the 1700s. And when archaeologists recently did some work in the olive grove, they found that the topsoil there was full of finely fragmented shellfish, which had washed down from the terraces above over time. So the sheltered northwestern slope, with its fertile volcanic soils mixed through with shells from the middens, created a perfect free-draining site for the olive grove. Now, for most of the period that Campbell was developing the grove, there was also a Chinese-run market garden beneath the trees, which adds yet another layer of complexity to the site. And here is Ming Kwong, who ran the market garden there for some years with his family. It's been assumed that Campbell had given up on the grove when he leased it as a market garden, but in fact the grove was thriving, and as some newspaper reporters observed at the time, it was partly because of the market gardeners who were constantly ploughing and weeding and applying manure to the grove. And here's another photo of the grove a few years later. When it came to carrying out the first pressing of the olives, Campbell sought the help of an Italian vintner called Giovanni Federli, who was in New Zealand trying to set up vineyards and orchards around the country. Federli spent a week overseeing the pressing operations, and at the end of it, he declared it a great success, calling the olive oil equal to the best in Lucca, Italy. Well, the next step for Campbell was to try and break into the international markets. He sent samples of his olives and olive oil to Portugal, where they received favourable reviews, but the olives that he sent to California leaked on the journey over there, and they were turned down by his agent in San Francisco, who told Campbell he was still trying to get the disagreeable bitter taste of the Auckland olives out of his palate. Well, Campbell continued to experiment with the olives throughout the 1890s, but he was let down by the lack of equipment and technical knowledge. And in the meantime, refrigeration was invented, and mutton, beef, and dairy products began to dominate the New Zealand economy. So the grove didn't last, and it would be 100 years before another commercial grove was planted in New Zealand. But what I think it shows is that even on the property of one of the most prominent, successful British settlers in Auckland, there were alternative articulations of empire at work. The grove had no single lineage. It was a mixture of Māori, North American, Italian, Chinese, and British influences. While it's important to acknowledge the dominance of the British Empire in shaping New Zealand, there are also other, more nuanced influences that shape a place, but can be hard to find until you look closely. Here in this forgotten corner of an iconic landscape, we can see the finer, more varied workings of a local community over time, as well as the wider international networks that were generated from this place. Well, not long ago, in 2015, the award-winning olive oil producers Margaret and John Edwards harvested and pressed the olives from Maungakiekie in their Waiheke oil mill for the first time in over 100 years. And it turns out that with the right equipment and knowledge, the olive trees produce very good olive oil. Margaret, who's an international olive oil judge, said it had excellent flavours. And I was lucky enough to get one of the olive oil bottles from the Maungakiekie grove, and here it is. And I can confirm, as can a few friends in the room today who I shared it with, that it's delicious. So, 3 places in Auckland, all with very different histories. What do these places tell us about this city? How do they change Auckland's history? Well, to begin with, I think they bring the physical environment into our histories in ways that often get overlooked. Auckland's lava fields, kumara gardens, trees, freshwater springs, rivers and harbours have actively influenced where and how people have lived across the city since they first arrived in around the 1300s. They are core historical factors that explain much about this city's past. Secondly, when you explore the layers of history embedded in places, you start to see the longer human connections between the deep past and the present. You can't understand Auckland today if you look at it with a short lens, if you start this century, or last, or even the one before that. There are deep Māori histories and networks and knowledge that have profoundly shaped the city over time and continue to do so. These longer histories are important to know if we're to understand the cities we live in today. And thirdly, I think these places all show more complex colonial histories of Auckland. The city becomes a place that is at once Indigenous, settler and international, with Māori tribal networks, missionary circuits, Chinese trading practices, raupatu or confiscation, and Mediterranean connections all present alongside the structures of the British Empire that have preoccupied historians of colonial New Zealand. These places show the unevenness of collective memory, what's been remembered and what's been forgotten over time. And finally, and perhaps most importantly, these places resist a singular, authoritative story about Auckland. When you start with the histories at your feet, it opens up Auckland's history. It makes room for the voices and the silences, for the presence and the absence that makes up this city's past. Thank you.